Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Political inCorrectors podcast. My name is Luke.
And my name is Eric.
It's good to be back. It's been 5 months since we recorded an episode. I know we always promised to get into a more regular upload pattern, but nonetheless, it's great to be back. And hopefully from here, we can finally fulfill our promise of uploading more regularly. But yeah, it's great to be back, Eric.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be back. Just a pesky fly annoying me here. But I'm delighted to be back. It's been a long time. I think you said before we started recording that it's been 5 months, which is nearly half a year, which is crazy. And I think it's probably worth sharing with listeners that we developed a new fan in a doctor that I saw recently. And what he said to me about Luke and my incongruency with regards to uploading was that we're like politicians. We promise everything on the manifesto, but then we never deliver when the time comes. But we're hoping we're going to disprove him, not only with this episode, but with future episodes, because we're going to be uploading far more, I think, in the near future. Luke has been super busy with academia, you know the story already, and I just back from Belgium for my Erasmus program. So the past year wasn't very convenient, but now you have a better Political inCorrectors podcast. So I'm really looking forward to delivering content to you all.
Yeah, so hopefully we can keep going and keep the doctor happy and keep up with the episodes. But yeah, look, it's been half a year pretty much. Obviously, we've done a lot personally, but politically, so much has happened in Ireland and across the globe. So much, whether it's the no confidence motion in the government a couple of weeks ago, or obviously to the extreme, the awful invasion of Ukraine. So much has happened that drastically changed the world since we last recorded. So I suppose there's lots that we could talk about, but today we're going to focus on two subjects. And I suppose the first is just like a kind of snapshot of the state of Irish politics over the last few months and what's happened over the past 6 months. And that kind of, we'll look at that through a number of different mirrors. And I suppose one of them is the most recent opinion polls. That kind of, and obviously opinion polls are a snapshot in time, but I think if we were to look at the most recent one, they're kind of all pretty much similar. And of course, Sinn Féin is on the very top, and the Irish Times, I just grabbed the numbers and might go through them, Eric, just so people are aware that that's like earlier this month, so 14th of July. Sinn Féin are on 36%, Fianna Fáil are on 20%, Fine Gael are on 18%, and Labour are on 4%. And then the Greens at the very bottom there on 3%. So quite drastic numbers, really, aren't they?
Yeah, they absolutely are. Something that I think is interesting to note from the outset, though, is that although Sinn Féin are leading, Fianna Fáil follow, and Fine Gael follow Fianna Fáil, I think the biggest trouble that all of the parties are in individually, especially the top three parties, fall on the Fianna Fáil side. I think it's actually funny how Fine Gael are third when it comes to popularity, Fianna Fáil are second, yet it's Fianna Fáil that seems to be in the crisis with regards to happiness amongst TDs, in terms of where they're at, in terms of popularity, their ability to appeal to the electorate. So I think that's quite paradoxical, because going by the poll alone, you'd think that it'd be a flip between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, but it's not. But I think the not so elephant in the room is Sinn Féin leading in the polls again. And I don't think there's been a poll since the general election where they've been anywhere but first, which is crazy. They're just increasing in popularity. The leadership poll also showed that Mary Lou McDonald was number one amongst the leaders. Remember in a past episode, we talked about how Sinn Féin were number one as a party in a poll, and Mary Lou, I think, was second to Leo Varadkar, whereas now Sinn Féin are leading in the individual leadership poll, but also in the party poll. So I think the tide is turning positively for Sinn Féin, and it's only increasing when it comes to its impact. Popularity is clearly there, and the continued popularity in the polls means that the polls can't be dismissed, I think, when it comes to thinking about Sinn Féin's popularity. Of course, we thought about some of the factors that might contribute to that, but Mary Lou being popular now is interesting. I think the fact that we're living in a cost of living crisis that's only going to get worse, I think is projected to worsen in the winter, will mean that naturally whoever is in the opposition is going to gain if they effectively do what oppositions do. So it's going to be interesting to see whether that heightens their popularity too.
Yeah, you're so right. And the leadership, that's a really good point, because before we had said, Sinn Féin are a very popular party, but if you look at the actual leadership numbers, Leo Varadkar was kind of always ahead from that kind of the start of COVID. He had a massive popularity boost, and he kind of stayed ahead. But if you look at the figures now, Mary Lou's on 43%, Leo Varadkar's on 36%, and Micheál Martin's on 40%. So he's even less popular, judging by this poll, than Micheál Martin, which is very interesting. But yeah, you said it really well there. It's clear if you look at those polls, any of the numbers, any of the recent polls, if you talk to anyone, it's almost dead certain that at the next election, Sinn Féin are going to win quite massively, and the likelihood is that Sinn Féin will lead the next government. And yeah, you're right again about the issues. I mean, there's so many issues in the country at the minute. The biggest one, the cost of living crisis, pretty much the cost of everything is going up. If you walk into a shop now, anyone, and picked up a basket of stuff, it's probably going to be much more expensive than it would have been 6 months ago. You know, everything's risen. I work in a shop, and a lot of stuff has risen in price by 50%, and that's obviously out of pure necessity because of the cost of everything. So yeah, it's the biggest issue, and I think people feel like that the government aren't doing enough, and the best way they can express their dissatisfaction is to say that that's enough of Fianna Fáil, that's enough of Fine Gael, and those pesky Greens. We need change. It's, you know, Tweedledum, Tweedledee is gone. They've had their chance, and let's go with Sinn Féin. And that seems to be the attitude, judging by the polls. That seems to be the attitude. And obviously, I think Sinn Féin tried to kind of bring that anger and dissatisfaction together with their motion of no confidence in the government, which took place, I think, 2 weeks ago now. And that was a big moment too.
It definitely was, and I think it's certainly worth getting into. The last thing I'd say on the polls, though, is that in terms of gains, I think it's interesting to note that so Fianna Fáil went down by 3 points, Fine Gael down by 4, Sinn Féin up by 3, but the independents, I think, made the largest gain. So they went up by 5 to 20%. So they're matched with Fianna Fáil. So technically, they're second place beside Fianna Fáil, which is, I think, interesting as well. I know the independents, it's a diverse hodgepodge of different politicians with different ideologies and the like, but it's interesting to see just independent politicians doing well too. And if Sinn Féin do enter government, how they're going to try and pick into that independent group to see who's going to help them to form a coalition. Labour are 4% also, which I'm sure was something that they took with a smile, because there's been questions about whether Labour I guess, are going to do well with regards to their identity, appealing to the electorate and the like. But yes, the vote of confidence. Luke and I were actually watching this with a friend of ours, Sean. We were like jamming messages into the WhatsApp group about different speeches, but it was really interesting. I think all in all, it would have, the outcome, of course, was favourable for the government. I think it was a very confident win for the government. There was a huge margin between those who voted in confidence or in favour of the government and those who voted against the government. I think it might be worth explaining for maybe listeners who don't know. A vote of confidence is just, as it says, a vote of confidence or no confidence in the government. So you have an opportunity to vote whether you are happy with the government or vote against your happiness, or you vote not in confidence with the government. And it's an existential question in that if the government doesn't have a majority of people supporting them, then the government's lifespan is threatened. So the government won. The more people voted in confidence and not in confidence. It was forwarded by Sinn Féin initially because some TDs did not vote in favour, or besides, some government TDs did not vote with the government on particular questions in the Dáil. I think one was the Mike redress scheme, and another, I think was a while back, a couple of months ago, was some Green Party TDs who didn't vote in favour of the government when it came to the precise question was around, I forget, Luke, do you remember what it was?
The which, sorry?
Remember a couple of months ago, I think some Green Party TDs didn't vote alongside the government on a particular question. Was it a cost? Yeah. Oh, it was the church. I think it was. Yeah, the church-state question.
Yeah, yeah. It was Nessa Horrigan, I think, and Joe O'Brien, I think, were the two who. Oh no, Patrick Costello.
Yes.
I think it was. I think you're right. It was the Mother and Baby Homes Records sealed the records vote. I think.
It was actually. It came to me. I think it was the hospital, maternity hospital. Yes. So I don't know. It took me a while, but long Eric story short. The opposition Sinn Féin saw these people not voting in the government, not voting with the government, as an opportunity to try and see whether they'd have a majority of people voting not in confidence with the government, which would collapse the government, and they failed. So after this, I think the government would have been happy, but of course that led to the polls, which wasn't so tasty for the government. But the speeches, Luke, was what I found really interesting, because I think in the speeches delivered in the Dáil, there was more time for government parties, less time for the opposition. But I think both sides really revealed their character, and a lot of, I think, shining figures emerged from both sides. I was really impressed with Ivana Basic's speech for the Labour Party, who was voting not in confidence with the government. I think she really represented a level-headed, sort of commonsensical social democratic politics, which was unfortunately in contrast to some extent with the leaders of the Social Democrats, whose speech I think didn't get to the bottom of what the social democracy philosophy really offers, the exciting nature of the philosophy that we see across Europe. I think Ivana Basic, if anything, is more of a social democratic champion than the offerings you see in the Social Democrats, only because I don't think they're really good representatives or harbingers for the philosophy. No real excitement, which I say, unfortunately. Sinn Féin, of course, they told the archetypal Sinn Féin line of Tweedledum, Tweedledee, it's time for a change. The hierarchy of FFG is holding us down. We need something new and something different, which will appeal to a lot of people. And then in Fine Gael, I think Ona Bryn's speech was really great. I think Mary Lou's speech was phenomenal. It was really, really good. She's a fantastic communicator. And then within Fine Gael, the speeches that stood out for me were Pascal Donohue's. I think he was fantastic, phenomenal. And they were great speeches all around. It was really an interesting watch. I think entertaining for any political nerd.
Yeah, it was a night of high drama for sure. And it was, so entertaining. It was like SmackDown versus Raw in the Dáil chamber. There was some really good speeches. I took down some highlights as well. I think my favorite one was Heather Humphreys, who's the Minister for Rural Affairs and Social Protection or something like that. It's like a funny mix of things. But she's in the Cavan Monaghan constituency. She's a real kind of rural woman with a real kind of Cavan accent or Monaghan accent, and she got up and said, and I'm not going to try and imitate her, but I'll tell you what she said. And about Sinn Féin, she said, Sinn Féin are a flip-flop party. When we opened the pubs during COVID, you wanted to close them. When we closed them, you wanted to open them. When we introduced targeted measures, you want universal measures. When we introduced universal measures, you want targeted measures. You say you want an emergency budget for COVID, but now you're voting for the government to collapse. And kind of just pointed out Sinn Féin's hypocrisy and said, look, your hurlers on the ditch. Whatever way the wind blows, Sinn Féin blows. And I just thought it was a great, very kind of layman's terms attack on Sinn Féin's what I do think is cynical politics. And then the Taoiseach said then as well, Neil Martin, he said that the debate of the motion of no confidence was a debate between those who believe in tackling problems and those who believe in exploiting them. And I do think that Sinn Féin did exploit a lot of problems that have happened over the last few weeks, whether it's the government losing some votes, so the 3 votes, as we said before, and the kind of wider cost of living crisis. They use this anger to challenge this, to put forward this motion, because they know the polls are in their favour, and if there was an election, they'd likely win. And they just took it as an opportunity to kind of bring down the government, rather than to like materially change anyone's position with the crisis that we have now with the cost of living. So I think they were dead right. I think the Taoiseach and I think Heather were spot on, to be honest with you, is my analysis. And, the government won. It was 85 votes to 66, which is quite a convincing lead. So there's definitely confidence for the government in the Dáil. And I'd be quite certain at this point, unless something crazy happens, that it's likely that the government will last the next 2.5 years. I think if they survive what's happened over the past couple of months, they can survive the next 2.5 years, personally.
Yeah, I definitely think internally within the Dáil, the vote definitely solidified the government's place in leadership. I don't think there's any substantial chance, as you said, Luke, of that place being questioned for the next term. Although one of the things that I'm sure we've both come across in recent times, and many people who might be listening to this, is the crisis within Fianna Fáil. It's something that I alluded to earlier when talking about the polls. There's a lot going on right now to essentially, I think, reckon with the question of who Fianna Fáil is. And this is a question that we actually broached earlier, I think last year, maybe 2 years ago. We had Uramo Adejimi, who was the former Caherlock of the Longford Municipal District, on our podcast, and of course a representative of the Fianna Fáil party on the local council in Longford, where Luke and I are based, mighty Longford. And we talked with Uramo about Fianna Fáil and their identity, and whether they have a distinctive identity that will appeal to the populace, and particularly younger cohorts within the populace now and into the future. And then it was a question that people were asking and thinking about, and certainly Luke and I were thinking about in our conversations on the podcast. But now it's something that I think is right in the face of everybody who cares for politics or cares for the Fianna Fáil party. So much so that recently there was a meeting of, I believe, 30 TDs and senators who came together essentially to discuss how Fianna Fáil can set itself apart from other parties, amongst other questions. Brian Cowan, I think, was one of the most notable politicians at that meeting, and he's come out publicly to talk about the need for this and how the parliamentary party might be out of touch with backbenchers who are really thinking about this issue, which is really, really interesting. It's a worry, I think, for many within Fianna Fáil, and it's going to be interesting to see where things go. And on the question of the government surviving for the rest of its tenure, I think claims came out that backbench TDs in Fianna Fáil don't want the rotation towards Leo Varadkar for him to become Taoiseach to occur in December, as it's scheduled to, as per the programme for government. And they claim that if it does happen, if Leo Varadkar does become the Taoiseach, then some TDs within Fianna Fáil might be happy and take action that might threaten the government's lifespan, existence, which is interesting news, all in all. I wonder how you interpret the whole, I don't know if we can call it Fianna Fáil identity crisis.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting, and it's probably like one of the biggest stories of this whole government is like seeing Fianna Fáil evolve from, you know, a completely irrelevant party that people thought were dying to leading this government, and now they're in, as you said, a kind of identity crisis. And I think people tried to frame this meeting of TDs to discuss the party's future as like a kind of backbench Fianna Fáil revolution. And I think Jennifer Bray, I listened to a podcast, the Irish Times political podcast, and she said it's more so just this kind of perennial Fianna Fáil identity crisis. They just don't know who they are or what they stand for, and they have been for a while. This party that kind of just flip flops between positions and tries to appeal to the widest group possible. And yeah, I think, to be honest, I think they're just afraid about what the future holds for them. I think they see Fine Gael, and even though Fine Gael, if you judge the polls, they're slightly less popular than Fianna Fáil are, I think they see that Fine Gael has their identity kind of tied down as this centre-right party. They're like economically liberal. They're about balancing the budget. They're about, you know, trying to put money back in families' pockets. They're stridently against Sinn Féin's policy and position. Whereas Fianna Fáil, I think, are much softer on whether they'd go in government with Sinn Féin, first of all. But they just don't know where they stand, because they see that Fine Gael has that space. They see that Sinn Féin has their space, and they're somewhere kind of in the middle, I think. And they just don't know what the future holds for them. I think it's that fear that's making them think about their identity and their future. And they blame a lot of it, I think, unfairly on Micheál Martin. They see that if Micheál Martin's gone, then that will somehow, you know, make way for them to find an identity. But I mean, if you look at anyone on their benches at the minute, like some of the names that you hear when it's thrown up about the future leaders, like Jim O'Callaghan, Derek Cleary, Michael McGrath, with all due respect to them, they're just so boring. Like they're not going to help Fianna Fáil get an identity. The most exciting name you hear is probably Darragh O'Brien, the Minister for Housing. He's still not great, with peace and love to Darragh O'Brien. I think some of the more interesting backbenchers in the Dáil are Jack Chambers, or no, more interesting names, they're members of the government. Jack Chambers, potentially Norma Foley could do a good shot of it, but still, I don't think it's inspiring. The more inspiring people for me in Fianna Fáil are in the Seanad. I think if they were to try and find someone to get in at the next Dáil, the likes of Lisa Chambers, Malcolm Byrne, I think they have a kind of centre-left kind of Republican outlook that could work for Fianna Fáil, but at the minute, I just don't see it in the party, and they're using this confusion to target Micheál Martin, which I think is completely unfair, and to say that Micheál Martin shouldn't bring the party into the next election, when really I think they should be thanking Micheál Martin for making the party relevant again in this government. He's done a great job, I think, as Taoiseach. He takes himself seriously. He positions himself as someone who takes the job of government seriously. And rather than kind of appreciate that and, appreciate him as someone who kind of stepped in and saved the party when it could have died, they're just kind of like bratty teenagers who aren't happy with the direction, and they're worried about their seats, I think. And I think they're going about it the completely wrong way. But of course, I could be completely wrong.
No, I totally agree with you, Luke. I don't think there is one point actually that I disagreed on or that I question in what you said. I think Micheál Martin has done a really good job. In the leadership poll, I believe that he came third behind Leo Varadkar, yet still, I think he's still amongst the top three, which you could say is to be expected to a certain extent, considering Fianna Fáil's long-standing popularity in Irish politics, the fact that they're in government. But to be a Taoiseach and to be, in the amongst the top three, I think is something not to be frowned upon. I think he's been rather popular in previous polls, considerably popular, considering the fact that he's a Taoiseach in a rather difficult moment for the state. He has managed state affairs quite well. I think he's represented Ireland quite well and taken the job very seriously. And I think there's a lot to be happy about if you're within Fianna Fáil about what Micheál Martin has done, considering the ingredients that he's been given, in light of the predicament we're in right now in Irish politics. I do completely concur with your point about what else, the other offerings within the party. I think they really need to be looking at distinctiveness. They have to be looking at something tangy, something you can taste. We've talked about personally and privately, the culture war occurring right now between Fine Gael and Sinn Féin. Both of those parties have something. I'm actually working on a piece on this subject at the moment, and something that I think about from this a sporting perspective, as someone who used to play sport regularly, is you love being on the winning side, you hate being on the losing side, but what's worse than both is being on the bench. You want to be playing, you want to be in the game, you want to be able to influence the affairs of the match. And Fianna Fáil right now, I think, simply aren't in the game. And even though they're in government, it's ostensible security, because as soon as that's over, you don't know where you'll be, because you have nothing tangy, nothing fruitful, tasteful for people to actually experience that's being offered by the party. It's a party of republicanism, but when you think of republicanism, what's the first party that pops to your head? For example, it's supposed to be prudent, caring for balancing the books. But when we think of that, first party, as you alluded to earlier, that pops to your head is Fine Gael. Environmentalism, when you think of that, you think of the Green Party. So there's nothing really that pushes Fianna Fáil in a lane of its own. And I think it needs to find that if it's going to appeal to any cohort within the Irish electorate. But it's going to be interesting to see how they take form in the coming years and what they do to really stand out. It's going to be interesting. I can't wait to see those young faces as well that you named from the Shinewood emerge and see what direction they take the party into. But something, Luke, that of course is very important now. I think it's going to have a prescient impact in Irish politics, in that it'll predict the state of it coming into the new year. There's a cost of living crisis, which you talked about earlier. And the big question I think that government parties have been dealing with, but also the opposition, is whether more action needs to be taken. And this, I think, it's not necessarily a complicated question. It's a complicated political question in that it offers an opportunity for, I think, on the opposition side, posturing as if it's an easy solution. All you have to do is apply the X key and all problems are solved. And I think the traditional response from the government side is, we're doing all we can. If you were in government, you'd see that, stay off our backs and do what you do best, throw rocks. But I think in between, there have been a lot of interesting contributions from both sides, but also from independents as well, about intervention that could occur. And state bodies, the CSO, I think, have chimed in to some extent, the Irish Financial Advisory Council too. There's also was a report from the Yes, all right, about what the government can do at these times. And I actually watched Leo Varadkar on the Tonight Show, Virgin Media, and on Virgin Media talking about the issue also. And I think the big question has been about whether there should be a universalist approach taken with measures introduced, or whether there should be a target approach. To explain, a universalist approach is an approach that aims to uplift everybody, just a rising tide that lifts all people up, or a targeted approach targeted at the most vulnerable groups within society. And I think Leo Varadkar talked about how there'll be both, but he was making the case for a universalist approach that specifically impacts middle-income households that are stuck in the middle, like in an awkward position where they can't get the medical card because they're seen as too wealthy, but at the same time, they're not as well off as very wealthy families, so they're hurt. And that, I think, is the traditional Fine Gael voting base to a certain extent. But Sinn Féin have been calling for an emergency budget implemented now. And this is actually a popular idea, I think, in the Tory leadership race, which we're going to get into soon. A lot of candidates, two that come to mind are, I think, Kemi Badenoch called for it, but I don't know if it was, I think it was Liz Truss too. I can't remember. This from a more conservative perspective, calling for an emergency budget, whereas the government have tried to talk about how the budget, we need to wait until the budget, because if we introduce measures now, it might fuel inflation. So it's been a really interesting one, Luke, and I think the responses reveal, I think, the underlying political reality that exists within every country. You saw the, as I said, the opposition, traditional opposition approach, traditional government approach, some nuanced responses in between. I think the most important thing to remember is that real lives and real families are being affected by this, and effective governance is needed, but we need to try and see how we can lessen the squeeze on families, because it's been really tough.
Yeah. One thing you said there I found interesting about, you mentioned the calls for an emergency budget here in Ireland, and that's kind of led by Sinn Féin. And you said that the two conservatives, Kemi Badenoch and Liz Truss, interestingly, two of the most populist figures in the Tory leadership debate, and we'll get into that. But I do think that's exactly it. Like, it's a populist call, because it's something that it's easy to say an emergency budget now. Let's do it. Let's fix the problem. But what specific measures will be included in that emergency budget that can't already be brought in now? And I think it's something easy to throw out. And, back to kind of what Heather Humphrey said, this is the Sinn Féin thing of kind of attacking the government for not doing enough, but opposing everything they do and asking for the opposite, and not really putting forward their own agenda. And obviously, the cost of living crisis, it's awful. It's having such an awful effect on families in Ireland, but also all across the world. It's something happening everywhere due to a lot of reasons. Obviously, Ukraine war being one of them, and the cost of energy as a result of the geopolitical consequences of that war. But I think I sat down and tried to look at some of the things the government have done, and there's people out there who'd have you think that the government are kind of sitting back, knowing there's a crisis that's really affecting families and people out there, and they're just kind of sitting back like, all right, lads, we'll just wait till the budget. But they have done stuff, and to give them credit again, not to be like a kind of government mouthpiece here, but like let's see. So they're abolishing.
Be careful, Luke. Be careful.
Have to be careful. Hospital charges for children are going to be abolished, so that's one way to keep money in families' pockets. Free contraception for women aged 17 to 25, another good measure. They increased the minimum wage this year. Student grant increases are coming in the next budget, so that will be a good thing that will help young people and families alike. Free school transport for the year, so free buses for families going to schools. It's another good thing. And lower levels of tax on petrol, diesel, electricity, gas that's ever been there. So they're just some things that I took down that the government are doing. So they're constructive things that will have a tangible effect on families' incomes and people's incomes and their pockets at the end of the day. But the question is it enough? And will the electorate feel like they're actually being helped properly? And to be honest, if you talk to people, it probably isn't. I don't think the majority of people are feeling the effect of government's help in their lives at this moment in time. And I just hope that come the budget in a couple of months' time, the government can do things radically that will transform people's lives and make them feel like they have more money and more ability to get through this crisis of living. So yeah, the budget will be one interesting thing to watch.
Yeah, I have no behavioural data to back it up, but I'm sure intuitively that people are more likely to feel a negative impact in their life than a positive one. I know that we humans, we don't think in a relative context. Right now, we're living in the best time it is to live as a human being, economically speaking, relative to our forebears. And yet, when something hard hits us, we feel it as if we're the only ones to ever exist. We live within our own dimension because we don't have a relative dimension in how we think, which I know that, okay, that's the behavioral finding. So I think when it comes to the positive measures that you speak to, despite the fact that they're being done, a huge cause for any government across the world is the fact that you have a populace that is less likely to feel these things, and they're more likely to think of it as marginal and ephemeral if they're not in touch with current affairs and politics, you could say, than those who are in touch with current affairs and politics. So communication will be important, but also with the budget, I know it's an unprecedented budget because the plan originally with Pascal Donoghue being the finance minister was for the budget to allow for, I believe, a 5% increase every time that it was introduced. Yet I think this budget, was above a 5% increase relative to the last one. I think it's a 6.7, sorry, not a 5%, but a 5 billion euro increase. I think that was a specific figure. I may be wrong, but it was over that with this budget. So it's unprecedented in the sense that it was higher than it was planned beforehand. And the increase in spending, I think, is reflective of the times that we live in too. So this, I think, is another measure being implemented by the government that is trying to speak to the crisis for what it is, a crisis. But it's another measure, I think, that's hard to communicate because it's not palatable, no matter what form it takes. I think ultimately for me, when it comes to the Sinn Féin, the government question on the budget is whether it's practicable to introduce an emergency budget or whether it's not, and what the arguments look like that support it or against it. And I think the arguments against the emergency budget has mainly been inflation. But I never think we should look at that from face value and say, okay, inflation bad, so be it, shove it out. Because in the case of COVID, we knew that putting money in people's hands and which would increase spending could cause inflation also, but we thought it was necessary considering the challenge. So I think it's a question of trade-offs, which is something we've talked about time and again. And trade-offs, how you see them are dictated by your ideological outlook. So Sinn Féin will see trade-offs in a kind of pro-left way, pro-left populist way, whereas the government will see it in a different perspective based upon their ideological outlook. And I think ultimately we have to try and be rooted in data. What impact will it have? Is it worth the blow? And which will hurt working people and ordinary people in Ireland more? And I guess in politics, there's never a right, quote unquote, answer to these questions. So it's a really interesting one, and I can't wait to see how things move forward. Clearly, not enough people on the door felt it was a question to topple the government. They had a lot of support. But once the public have their say in election time, will this be something that comes back to bite? Will the external environment bite the government, even though the internal one doesn't, when the time comes? Or will we come out of this not untouched, but relatively okay? And might that actually bolster government support? It's going to be interesting to see how these questions are answered.
Yes, and I guess we'll just have to wait and see. And if we keep our promise to that lovely doctor, we'll talk about this lots over the next few weeks and months and keep an eye on it. But other big news to kind of shift away from Ireland for a bit. In the midst of all the high drama of motions of no confidence and the risk of the government falling apart here, Boris Johnson was hounded out of office by 60 of his fellow party members.
Bye, Bojo. I've always wanted to say that for the sake of alliteration.
You got your moment there. You got it. Yeah, he's gone. And it was, you were probably the same as me, Eric. I was absolutely glued to Sky News. I was trying to do bits during the day, and it was always there. And all those Sky News presenters, I feel like they were my best friends over those few days because they were keeping me entertained. But it was crazy to watch as, initially Sajid Javid, the Chancellor, Sajid Javid, he was the Health Secretary, and Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, both resigned at the pretty much same time. And that just triggered resignations after resignations after resignations. There was a live counter on the news of counting how many people would go, and every half an hour it felt like there was more people going. It kind of the thing that spurred people on, I think, was like allegations and crisis or scandal around Chris Pincher, who I think was the deputy government chief whip. and there was allegations of sexual harassment labelled against him. And apparently Boris Johnson knew this, but still promoted him. But he lied about knowing about it, and it just it turned into a big scandal of did he know, did he not know, when did he know, and he lied. Downing Street lied to the press. But I think a lot of it, I think Tory MPs just saw it as time. This is just one more thing, another lie from Boris Johnson, so it's time for him to go. But it was a really dramatic few days and really entertaining few days. I'm sure you'll agree, Eric.
No, it certainly was. In terms of being glued to Sky News, I actually feel like I'm personal friends to Kay Burley and Sophie Ridge right now because of how much I was watching them as the drama unfolded. And I think in terms of why the resignation came, you really hit the nail on the head. The Chris Pincher allegation was simply rather controversy was literally the straw that broke the camel's back. And there was thing after thing after thing. Of course, Partygate was a huge catastrophe for the Boris Johnson government. There were lies told about whether a full-fledged party took place, and when an investigation was occurring to try and see whether a party actually happened, Boris Johnson was, number one, lying about the occurrence of such a party and deferring to the investigation process to try and buy himself time, which he did very effectively. And he introduced populist policies, which I think political commentators called red meat, to throw out to the public to distract them essentially from what was occurring behind the scenes in Downing Street and in the Conservative Party. But I think his time came, the bell rang, and eventually what a lot of people have wanted to see has happened, and Boris Johnson has stepped down. I think I found it to be an example of how cold-hearted Machiavellianism in politics serves one only to a certain extent. And after a while, integrity does matter, honesty does matter. And if you don't uphold these values, it's going to bite you in the back. And Boris Johnson, I think what worked for him for a long time was that he was seen as the leader who could win, who could get things done. The mandate that he won from the British public, which is probably the wrong way to frame it, winning a mandate from the British public per se, but the majority that he won in the election that put him into his position of political power was astounding and was very strong and was historical in a sense. So I think that is something that worked in his favor. He was seen as a quote-unquote winner, but when push came to shove, integrity mattered. And I think that's what essentially toppled Caligula from his emperorship. And here we are in a position where there's a Tory leadership contest. And this has probably saw me tied to my television and my laptop more than anything. It's been really interesting to see. Initially, I think there were a dozen people who came forward initially to run. A lot of familiar faces. So Jeremy Hunt, who ran to be the Tory leader last time and who lost in the final to Boris Johnson. Sajid Javid, and as we expected, Rishi Sunak, Nadeem Zahari as well. So these are, I think, the popular figures. And a huge surprise for me, Luke, was the fact that in the first round, many of these popular figures were eliminated. And I think it became boiled down to figures who might be seen as underground figures, but nonetheless spoke to the heart of the Conservative Party base. And I think that's an interesting revelation for the Conservative Party, but for everyone interested in politics in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, it was just I feel like it felt like I was watching a soap opera when I was watching it. The one highlight for me was so he hadn't resigned yet. He appoints Nadeem Zahawi to be his chancellor. Nadeem's happy about this, to be Boris Johnson's chancellor. One of the biggest offices in the state. The next day, Mr. Zahawi, the newly appointed chancellor, goes to Boris Johnson and threatens to resign if Boris Johnson doesn't resign. So it's this big power grab. He's chancellor, and now he's like, thanks, but you need to go now. It was crazy. And then that day as well, he made Michelle Donnellan, I think her name was, the secretary for education, and I think she resigned the next day. So she lasted one day as secretary of education. There was these crazy moments, like House of Cards, like these crazy political moments. But obviously, what we have now is an equally crazy leadership debate that's had some, really interesting moments, really interesting figures emerge. Figures emerged that not from obscurity, but people you'd never think would be, on that stage trying to be the next Prime Minister of the UK, especially when you look at people like you said, Jeremy Hunt, Sajid Javid, Nadeem Zahawi, who were there trying to put themselves forward, and they ultimately didn't get near the top. And at the top, I think, you know, in those last few debates, you had Kemi Badenoch, Tom Tugendhat, Penny Mordaunt, Rishi, Liz. Those five were kind of the main ones, and what an interesting group of people! Like, fascinating stuff to watch. Scary for the UK, but fascinating group of individuals. You know, you have I think Tom Tugendhat was probably the most normal person there. Kind of centre left of the party. I think he was a Remainer. He was in the army. He really wanted a fresh start or a clean start. I don't know why he said it over and over again. And, you know, you had these great extremes. You had, you know, the kind of more centrist, moderate people like Tom. You have Liz Truss, who is a very interesting figure, to say the least. And I think the most interesting person, we spoke about this a lot over the course of the few days of the debate, was Kemi Badenoch, who I think her last position was an Equality Secretary. But she was a fascinating individual, quite populist, quite right-wing in her positioning, but I think we spoke about her most probably out of anyone on those final five.
Yeah, no, we definitely did, and that was probably because of my obsession with her getting so far in the race. I think that really took me by surprise, and I've done a lot of digging into Kemi Badenoch over the past while, and I actually wrote a piece involving Kemi Badenoch that I shared with Luke that you could all access on. I don't know if I'll go into it now, but it's called
Go for it.
Representation in Politics Matters, or Does It? And you can access it on The Political Edge, which is a political media outlet that publishes pieces on politics. So yes, check it out. I'd appreciate it. Lots of love. Eric from the Political inCorrectors podcast. But Kemi Badenoch really stood out to me. Of course, I'm Nigerian Irish, she's Nigerian British. So there was one part of my brain that was thinking, okay, representation matters. This is a big deal. This is really appealing to me as someone interested in politics. But then a lot of commentary around Kemi Badenoch. And it's important for me to note, Luke, that an unprecedented number of ethnic minorities actually went for the Tory leadership leader post, and therefore 10 Downing Street, the position as Prime Minister, which is to me a big deal as someone who cares about representation in politics. We actually talked about this in our last episode with Isabel Flanagan, a former member of the Stock Dems, and Jane Butler of Fianna Fáil. And I think it's a big deal, someone running from an ethnic minority background to be the Prime Minister. But a lot of commentary around Kemi Badenoch was very pejorative, I think very derogatory, very not disrespectful per se, but critical. And I think the classical argument was that she's a part of the Tory party. I don't care if she's from an ethnic minority background. Her politics are destructive for people from minority backgrounds. My perspective is that a lot of people making this point come from a traditionally left-wing outlook. So they're obviously going to think that the Tory party politics is bad. If you spoke to someone in the Tory party or the Conservative, from a conservative political background, they might favour Badenoch and use the representation argument. Me, as someone who, of course, has my political character, but cares more for representation more than anything because of what it brings to a political culture, I think Kemi getting involved in politics is incredibly inspiring. As someone who's Nigerian Irish, that was a big deal for me seeing her on stage. Luke will tell you, debating. So yes, I think representation matters, and it's something that we should promulgate. There will be people who undermine it as a value because of political bias, but I don't think we should let that get in the way if we truly care for representation, or else we're promoting hegemony and not different voices. And I think this is something about Kemi Badenoch that really saw her increase in popularity. I watched tons of her interviews, listened to some podcasts as well, and her whole approach has been one which has been unorthodox in that she's been critical of the BLM organization, for example. She's also was one of the harbingers of the Sewell report released 2 years ago in the UK in the height of the BLM protest, which essentially made the case that systemic racism was not the only reason for disparities between ethnic minorities. But she's also a fan of Thomas Sowell, a conservative economist in the USA, who essentially makes a similar argument when it comes to looking at disparities between groups. We should take a more analytical approach and the like. And I think this is a very unpalatable thing for a politician to do, only to a particular cohort that might be interested in it. She's a quite scientific politician in her analysis because of her engineering background, so she claims. So I think she's a very unorthodox figure, and it appealed to a large swath of the conservative base. I think if she had got to the final two now, she would have been the undeniable winner. I think we would have been able to predict it in advance because of how appealing it is to the Conservative base. So yes, Kemi Badenoch, an interesting figure. I certainly don't agree with her politics. I say that on record now. But I come from a town called Longford, which taught me not to judge people by the color of their politics, but the content of their hearts. And now we're left with Liz Truss and Richie Sunak. And something that's important, Luke, is for us to think about how they'll be for Ireland, because I don't think any would have been great for Ireland. So, like in the US elections, I guess it's a question of who's the lesser of two evils from our perspective.
Yeah, and look, I had a little bit of a think about this, and to be honest with you, I think they're both bad for Ireland ultimately, because they're part of Boris Johnson's cronies. They were in his government up until the very end. Clearly, no interest in peace on the island of Ireland, just interest in their kind of Brexit little brainchild that they think is going to make the UK a great place again. But I know clearly isn't. Obviously, initially, if you spoke to people, they'd say that anyone but Liz Truss. But I think that's just because Liz Truss was the Foreign Secretary and was the one who was talking about this issue, and who was against the Northern Irish Protocol, the border being down the Irish Sea, even though that was agreed with the EU like 3 years ago. They decided that they're going to go against it now because it's not working for them, like the rest of their Brexit project. And interestingly, actually, just a side point on Brexit, if you want to see how they're both practically the same, on the BBC debate, I think it was, I didn't actually see the whole thing myself, but they're both talking about wanting to be honest politicians. They want to be a break from Johnson. And there's been massive trouble at the ports in the UK recently with obviously the new customs checks because they're outside of the EU, which is their own decision. But the presenter asked, "Is this the result of Brexit?" And they both nearly jumped at each other to say no, quickly, to say this is nothing got to do with Brexit. So they're liars, and they just want to make this Brexit thing work. Interestingly, Liz Truss was a Remainer back in the debate, but like Boris Johnson, I think she's a political opportunist, and she'll change her colours to suit what she thinks will get her votes. So I think we know more about Liz Truss because the nature of her being Foreign Secretary. But I'd imagine if Rishi supports the line of that government, he'll be much the same, to be honest with you. I think it's going to be a challenging time ahead for Anglo-Irish relations. It's probably not going to be good, to be honest.
Yeah, something that I've really appreciated from our Taoiseach Leo Varadkar is how honest he's been when talking about the UK. I think that's something that he's appreciated for generally in politics, just being really candid and honest, not necessarily by his political friends, because it's costly having to face the truth as it is, but on the UK relations, he's time and again talked about how it's in a really hostile place, arguably the most hostile place it's ever been in over the past few decades. And I think from our perspective, this is really shaky because the Good Friday Agreement, in historical terms, relatively speaking, was only yesterday. And we don't need things shaking it up now, especially with calls for United Ireland from Sinn Féin, who might be in government in the south and who have a first minister in the north. We need relations to be stable. We need things to be going okay. Brexit just happened, which caused severe disruption. We need things to be steady. And in the UK, I think we have no assurances of this right now. Boris Johnson, as you said, Luke, a political opportunist, likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg in his cabinet, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, simply trying to, I think, dance around the reality of Brexit when it comes to its negative consequences, to sell the populist vision and argument of sovereignty, wumpty, the talking points, to be completely respectful, because maybe there's a philosophical case to be made for sovereignty, but still. So it's going to be important for whoever enters number 10 to, deal with things as they are. I think the NI protocol bill, something that both are going to support anyways, which is essentially going to, as you said, Luke, backtrack on the agreement to import the border on the Irish Sea. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. It's hard to know who will be best for Ireland, but to go with the piecemeal things I think we've been given from both candidates, Truss stayed until the end with Boris, and a big argument she's using against Richie in the debates is one of loyalty, how Sunak was not loyal to Boris because he left, which I think is a really bad argument. And I think any politician should see that as a gift to pick through it. It's like, yeah, integrity over loyalty to a bad thing. You know, so many things you could work with there. But Sunak left because he saw something wrong, and he seems to approach politics in a more moderate, commonsensical way. Truss goes for a dogmatic Thatcherism to the point where she dresses, imitating Thatcher on stage, literally. Sunak talks about how he wants a common sense Thatcherism. It's still Thatcherism, but it's on the better end of the spectrum, you might say, if you disagree with that politics, without taking an overt ideological side. So from here in Ireland, our perspective, I think that is more acceptable. Someone who will at least be able to sit around the table and talk, who knows what's right and that right is right and wrong is wrong, and who will hopefully become moved by the stories from the North with regards to our history, recent history, but also where it is we need to go in terms of relations here in Ireland, North and South, but also between the UK and Ireland. So hopefully a Sunak Prime Minister would offer more, but I don't think it's likely that he'll win. It seems like the base is adamantly in support of Truss because she's closer to the right than Sunak is. So Liz Truss, Prime Minister, Liz Truss at number 10, might be what is on offer. And I'm not going to lie, it's rather scary.
Yeah, I think you're right. Look, I hope that, you know, if Rishi was to do it and was to become Prime Minister, he would take the issue more seriously. I think he's more of a kind of in the vein of like his kind of appearance and his approach and his charisma is more in the vein of the kind of David Cameron, George Osborne kind of Tory, who's kind of more sensible and isn't kind of a clown, to put it frankly, like Boris Johnson. I think Liz Truss is just a slightly more presentable clown. But Rishi's more serious, so he might take the Northern Ireland issue more seriously. But I mean, if you look at it, it just seems to be something the UK, or I mean, so I suppose England, there's lots of people in Northern Ireland who care about this. Mainstream kind of English media, it's something they just don't care about. There was major debates on practically every network, and no one asked the candidates about the Northern Ireland Protocol. It hasn't come up. They haven't spoke about it. Yet it's one of the biggest things that threatens the whole of the project of the UK because it threatens unity. And the union, which the Tories are supposed to care about, but they evidently don't. So yeah, it's going to be very interesting. And of course, you have the issue of Scottish independence as well. So it's going to really test the kind of unionist aspect of the Conservatives. But yeah, I suppose just to kind of think about the debate, if we just, for people who might not know, obviously it's been whittled down to two candidates, so Liz and Rishi. The MPs did that business. They kind of backed candidates until they got to the final two. And now the membership, Tory party membership, will vote for who they think will be the better Prime Minister, the better leader of their party. And we'll get that result on September the 5th, which is crazy. That's so long away. The general elections happen quicker than this leadership election. But anyway, we'll have to wait until then. But yeah, predictions. I suppose I think you're right. It looks like the writing's on the wall and it's going to be Liz Truss as Prime Minister, which, I mean, you said it's scary. It's most certainly scary. She just... with all due respect, I think she's incompetent. You just need to look at some of her interviews and speeches over the years to say that she just doesn't seem like someone who should be Prime Minister of one of the most influential countries in the world. It is quite scary. But I would, if I was to predict, I'd say that Liz Truss is going to be the next Prime Minister and next leader of the Tory party.
Yeah, I've actually seen that people who submit a vote of the Conservative base, firstly, they're going to get their ballots at some point in August. I can't remember the exact dates. And then if they submit a vote, they can actually retract their vote and submit a new one in support of someone else. So between now and then, I think, firstly, Sunak is going to be banking on the gap between now and the moment when ballots are received. And then also he's going to be hoping that people retract their votes if they do vote in favour of Truss. That's a serious commitment, a costly one that requires energy that I don't know people will be willing to expend for Rishi Sunak, considering the fact that the Tory base is just so ideologically to the right. Truss simply, I think, tickles those feathers better than Sunak does in terms of our politics. So it's going to be very interesting to see how things pan out. I think we can be sure that Truss will have Johnson and the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg, staunch Brexiteers, if not in her cabinet, but in her ear, guiding her with regards to policy, which is not going to be favourable for Ireland. So if she is Prime Minister, I'm hoping for a serious U-turn in the approach and a recognition of the importance of maintaining peace in the North for all of our sakes. And as you said, Luke, it's really interesting how in the debates, and I know this is a separate topic that we can probably get into in a different episode, the questions surrounding the Northern Ireland Protocol weren't asked, really consequential ones, but the question, what is a woman, came up. You know, I think it alludes to, it points towards how strongly the culture war, how pervasive it is within politics in this side of the world. When it comes to serious matters such as the question of who's going to be the next prime minister, how seriously it pervades our politics, the culture wars, so much so that we forget other substantial, fundamental political questions such as dealing with Brexit, its residues, and peace in Northern Ireland, and unity of the unity of the Union. It's going to be interesting to see what the next chapter holds for UK politics, but also politics over here too, especially in light of this culture war influence.
For sure, yeah. And one of the biggest topics of debate in the last debate was, I think Nadine Dorries attacked Rishi Sunak for wearing a very expensive suit that cost €4,000 and very expensive shoes, and said that Liz's earrings are from Claire's and they cost £4. And that's the level of debate that's happening. Yeah. Crazy.
Liz, and therefore she's a bastion of the working class.
Yes.
You judge it based upon how much the earrings cost. Oh gosh, but I am really happy. Well, I wouldn't say happy, maybe a bit doomy, but I tend to be an optimistic person, like my co-host Luke. Yeah, I'm optimistic about the future of, even if I'm pessimistic about the future of politics in the British House, I'm optimistic about the future of the Political inCorrectors podcast. And you all can be too. To my doctor, my very kind doctor. There will be more episodes. To our listeners, there will be more episodes in the near future. And hopefully we'll get into a regular stream that you all can be happy with. And we're hoping to deliver premium content around Irish politics and keeping you all up to date as to what's happening in Irish politics and doing some innovative, some cool things with regards to dealing with subjects in politics. We've definitely floated a lot of cool ideas over the past while. But thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Political inCorrectors podcast, our episode back. We've probably said that too many times. Hopefully the number of times we say back after closing an episode reduces into the future. And yes, we really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please follow us on YouTube if you're watching the video. So subscribe to our channel. Like the video also if you can. We'd really appreciate that. Follow our podcasting platforms wherever you're listening to us. Make sure to like the podcast. That is really helpful for us, and give us a high rating if you rate us highly, which I'm sure you do. Stay tuned for future uploads. We're definitely going to be back with an episode very, very soon. So thank you so much for joining us again with this episode. We're very excited to see you in the next one. Bye.
Slán.